Hello and welcome to the Malika Writes channel. My name is Malika Writes and today we are going to be talking about fairy tales. So I think we've all established by now that fairy tales were not written to be read predominantly by children. When we look at Snow White's mother trying to kill her and Cinderella's stepsisters treating her that badly, and also at the end where, her birds peck out the eyes of her stepsisters. These are not children's tales, especially not ones that you would read to children before bed. And you can kind of say what you want about our ancestors, but even they knew that you shouldn't scare kids before bed. I mean, you can kind of kiss your sleep goodbye if you tell them a scary story before bed, because you'll have to spend the next hour sort of calming them down after you've scared them. And the slightest noise will set them off. Like, you'll have to spend an hour explaining why God decided to make foxes sound like screaming children. So, fairy tales are cautionary tales, and for the most part they follow the heroic tradition that we find in myths. Unlike the novel, which is an art form that focuses on the lives of characters that emulate human beings, fairy tales, epics, and myths center around one main conflict, and that conflict is order versus chaos. So fans of Jordan Peterson will probably have heard these two words exhausted to death, but I'm going to be bringing them up just to discuss exactly why this is the case. There are still many places today where a hiking trip can easily turn into a disaster of epic proportions. Although it's rare, there were 8 bear attacks in Canada this year and 2 of them ended in fatalities. The world is much safer, but it's not danger-proof. So myths, epics, and fairy tales are just as relevant today as they were yesterday. Little Red Riding Hood on the surface warns about the dangers of strangers, but it is at its core a story about chaos. And this is kind of represented by the woods and the wolf. One thing you find a lot of in fairy tales are woods. To the original authors and audience, the woods would have been a very scary place and the symbol of chaos. Anything could happen in the woods, and for any musical lovers here, you'll know that the concept of anything can happen in the woods is the basis for the musical Into the Woods. Into the Woods takes the traditional fairy tales, expands and interweaves them, all in the setting of the woods. The place of chaos where anything has the potential to happen. In previous videos, I've spoken about the duality of chaos, and that in one sense chaos is destructive, but it's also potential. We've all probably had a teacher who told our parents that we have so much potential and we could achieve so much if we just focused. The same concept applies here. That focus is bringing yourself into order so that this chaos you're manifesting, which your teacher has so delicately called potential, can actually produce something productive. That's the main plot of fairy tales, epics, and myths. If we look at Beowulf, for example, one of the great Germanic myths, thought to have been composed sometime in the 7th century. This chaos versus order battle becomes clear. The monsters are manifestations of chaos and they attack civilizations because chaos is opposed to order. The hero has to confront this chaos for the sake of those who are dependent on that order surviving. So how does this kind of apply to a modern audience? Because we know how this would have been perceived by its primary audience, who were living in a much more dangerous environment. So this heroism would have not just been to remind them of the chaos that they live in, but also to instill a sense of courage. These stories would have been read not just in groups, but also to help people sort of visualize what these acts of heroism look like. But how does this apply to a modern audience where we don't have to go and hunt animals for our food? We can if we want to, but it's not a necessity. So I think right now in the culture, the conversation dominating society seems to be male and female relationships. Everyone has something negative to say about the dating scene, and people have made a pretty penny selling courses, books, and other guides on how to navigate this minefield called dating. So here's how this understanding of fairy tales applies to dating. When you understand that civilization itself rests on the maintenance of order against an ever-present chaos, the relationship between the sexes becomes much less about who is more oppressed or who's more privileged, but it becomes collaborative. Fairy tales have been accused of being misogynistic for longer than I've been alive. And this is kind of because they portray women as helpless damsels in distress who their only kind of noticeable trait is their beauty. So if we take Snow White and Cinderella, for example, these two girls were mistreated by almost everyone that they knew, and yet they still remained trusting and kind. There's an emphasis on their physical beauty and the kindness of their hearts and all of that. Unless we're aware of the underlying conflict in fairy tales, this portrayal doesn't make sense, especially when the reality of life for the majority of women, not just in the primary audience, but also a modern audience, the reality is not ball gowns and fancy festivals and things like that. When we add the male element, the hero, it makes more sense, but it still kind of has that oh, women have to sort of wait around for men to rescue them sort of flair. But when we look at it in the context of it's a collaborative effort, it makes a lot more sense. The hero must overcome fear and doubt to confront chaos. And the woman in the situation has to become a woman worthy of that sacrifice with her virtues and her beauty. So what has ultimately happened in our modern dating scene is that women have rejected this role as motivation for men to sort of make this sacrifice. And men no longer wish to make that sacrifice. The argument goes round and round in circles with both groups unwilling to do anything. There is no incentive to do anything on both sides. And we kind of shift our attention away from the fact that our civilization depends on our active contribution. And we forget that chaos is always lurking on the borders of our civilization. Hypergamy becomes exaggerated as women gravitate towards men who ironically display this quote-unquote toxic masculinity. The same sort of capitalist, tall, muscular, handsome man with a lot of options that's usually condemned by society, but this sort of man gets the most likes on dating apps. He is the main protagonist in books like 50 Shades of Grey. After all of this contradicts the societal message. And what we have on the male side is that men just check out of society because they have no personal stakes, and that's how the cookie crumbles. So fairy tales contain the understanding that chaos is ever present and order must be protected and actively preserved. So we've largely taken this for granted, and it's beginning to show in our society. Institutions that stood the test of time were brought down because we didn't examine their value before tearing them down. And we can only look at things in hindsight now that it's gotten to a point where we're beginning to see the consequences of those actions. I'm not a nihilist, so I don't think this is the end of Western civilization, but it's not exactly the shining utopia that was promised after the sexual revolution. Of course, I'm not saying that women should be helpless princesses waiting for a man to rescue them, and I don't believe that the authors of these tales meant that either, considering that this option was only open to noble women and literally no one else. Instead, these tales speak to the spirit or essence of these concepts that are too complex to explore in a short story. So I think that when we consider what these stories are trying to say and the essence of them, of course, we're not asking men to literally jump into extreme dangerous situations unwarranted. We're not asking women to do absolutely nothing except look pretty. In fact, in the Snow White story, we see how toxic that makes her mother. Snow White's mother becomes so obsessed with her looks that she tries to kill her daughter because her daughter is more fair than her, because she places all her value in her physical beauty. So there is a balance to these things. And if you want to, see more of that, I would actually recommend watching my Proverbs 31 woman video. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope I've given you something to think about. I look forward to your comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day. This has been the Malika Writes channel.